Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. This week, we return to France. It's been quite a week for the country's nuclear plants. On Monday, EDF announced that it would cut its 2022 nuclear production target by about 5% to between 295 and 315 terawatt-hours. Then, after we recorded this episode, President Macron announced plans for new reactor build. I caught up with Chris Eales, editor France at Montel, after our recording ended. So, Chris, what did Macron say?
Yeah, well, Macron has said that France will build 6 EPRs, with the first due to come online by 2035. He also said that they would study options to build 8 more reactors in a horizon of by 2050, in line with carbon targets. He also said that he wanted EDF to extend all of its reactors, or as many reactors as possible, beyond 50 years of running times. And that would have to be in line with France's Nuclear Safety Authority, ASN. That's quite interesting. He also talked about a massive development of renewable energy, saying that they would increase solar targets by tenfold by 2050 with an aim of installing 100 gigawatts of solar capacity, by targeting 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by the same time. France will put in place new regulation of the sale of EDF's nuclear output, which means replacing the current system. The current system is called ARENH, so they will replace that, where under this system, EDF must sell output at 42 euros to rivals in France. Those are the major points, I think. There's also reiterating a €1 billion investment in small reactors and investments in hydrogen, which has already mentioned in the past.
Brilliant, Chris. Thanks very much for updating the podcast. And now, listeners, back to our earlier recording. Helping me to discuss France's targets, the new output target in particular, was Chris, who you've just heard, but also Paolo Coghe, who's the CEO of Acousmatics. Good to have you back, Paolo.
Good morning, and it's nice to be back.
Perfect. Let's start with events this week. What did EDF announce earlier, and why is it important not only to France, but its neighbours, Chris?
EDF reported another cut in the nuclear output target, as you mentioned in the intro. What's interesting is this cut isn't that particularly deep. It's 5%, as you said, but it's the second cut in less than a month. And so that's what's interesting. And the earlier cut was much more important. It was a 10% cut from what they had previously predicted. And it's a very, very low. I mean, these figures, if it was to go as low as 295, I think that would be one of the lowest on record. I don't think they predicted that kind of output. The last time they predicted that kind of output was I think it was 1991 or something like that. So it's way below. And if you compare to last year, they produced 360. And then before that, 2020, 335. Those are COVID years. So then the next meaningful comparison is 2019, and that was 379. So we can see it's a long, long way. It's a lot lower than that. So it's interesting. So now they've said that the reason for these cuts in both cases, in the one in mid-January and this one, is the corrosion issues which could affect the entire fleet, because what they've said is very interesting, that they're talking about potentially 11 reactors at the moment affected, 5 of which are already offline, 3 to go off quite soon, and another 3 where inspections will take place during planned maintenance outages. What's interesting about the latest announcement regarding the corrosion issue is that these concern reactors of all types, in other words, of all ages. So it's not just the old ones. We've got the 2 900s being looked at, 1.3, so that's 1.3 gigawatts, and 1.5 gigawatts. So this, it could suggest that there's quite a wide scale problem here. For France, there's 56 reactors, one of the biggest nuclear generator in Europe. This kind of situation is very, very, is obviously boosting prices in France already, obviously, but it's having an impact right across Europe as well, because outages in France, reactor outages in France have a huge impact across Europe. They drive prices, as we all know.
What do you make of this latest announcement?
I'd like to go back with the news, and I'd like to expose some news from July 2021. I think it's newsworthy because back in July 2021, EDF upgraded its nuclear output estimate, right? So it went up by about 5% to 345, 365. So essentially, all along last year, things were going well. A market recovery from the 2020 sort of COVID impact, proceeding well on the works, and then lightning hits again, right? So this is a little bit the plight of EDF. Everything is fine until it isn't. And in this latest case, we've had a sort of a double whammy where EDF realized problems. Problems hit two of the largest and more modern types of units, the 1450 megawatt units. So that, comparatively speaking, hits, only two reactors of that type, obviously way more than the older 900 megawatt reactors. And then, as we've seen again and again, time and again, since EDF has built its reactors in a succession using the same or similar, slightly more modern technology, it has been able to capitalize on experience, to save on costs, but at the same time, it remains, as ever, exposed to a fault being found in one of the units or types of the units, therefore, potentially extending to other similar units and therefore blocking operations to conduct additional inspections. So this is not the first time it happened. Things were going well for EDF, and then all of a sudden they didn't. And then to add to this, of course, the timing is, again, as usual, pretty bad because it's coming in the high season where there is higher demand because of seasonality. And on top of that, it's coming in a situation which is the European-wide sort of energy price crisis that certainly is not making things easier.
February's been quite mild, hasn't it, Paolo? So in a sense, EDF's been quite lucky. If we were having sub-zero temperatures, the beast from the east that's come in February before, then we'd be in a bit more trouble.
Correct, absolutely. So the two things that have been the, in quotes, saving grace for EDF are, number one, up to now, and including the forecast by RTE for February, a mild winter. No prolonged long episodes and diffused episodes of cold. They would have certainly made things worse. And then at the same time, the fact that even though things are going much better than recently, even though the pandemic impact has been reabsorbed, the reality is that demand in France, especially at the level of the large industrial consumers, the grand industry, is still significantly lower than the demand from this, customer segment. It's lower than it used to be before the crisis, and so that, everything else being the same, is helping EDF out. In terms of the production, by the way, I looked the number up. The last time the number was so low, but above 300 terawatt hours, was in 1991 with 315 terawatt hours. So this year, if the forecast is correct, will be below 300 for the first time since 1990.
That's astonishing. Chris, what do we know about the problems at these reactors? I mean, do we have any details? What's been published so far?
What we know is that what we've been told by the Safety Authority and by EDF is that this is a question of corrosion on the pipes that they're called safety injection circuits, which they're needed in the event of an emergency. Then this circuit would be used to cool reactors to avoid a kind of Fukushima type meltdown. So they're extremely important. What we know is that, according to IRSN, which is the technical arm of ASN, the French Nuclear Safety Authority, this corrosion can lie dormant, if you like, for several years, apparently. It's very, very difficult to detect. This is possibly why they haven't been able to find it in earlier checks. When the reactors go off for their long 10-year inspections, these kind of things are examined. But they didn't find these cracks on these pipes during some of those inspections. And that's because of the way these cracks operate, the way they grow very, very slowly and can only be detected once cracks have appeared. I mean, that sounds a bit strange, but what I'm saying is this incubation period, if you like, takes a while, and then you need a good ultrasound to be able to detect them. So that's a problem for them. They don't know exactly what is causing this, because it's important to point out, Paolo, that it's not only the more recent reactors affected, because the latest information now is that there are at least two 900 megawatts, which are the oldest ones, at Bougie, and another one I can't remember the name of immediately, but that suggests that that's quite tricky because it's different ages, So that's going to be interesting when they try to analyze the causes for this, I understand. Well, from IRSN, I also know that there have been cases. This is not the first time it's happened. There have been 150 cases elsewhere in the world in the past. I don't know exactly where, but these reactors are designed in America, so it might be interesting to probe the Americans to find out what they know about this issue.
And I'm sure we have some reporters on the case.
Can I just add that more in general, emphasis and concern for the nuclear industry are skewed towards system safety, right? First and foremost, at the expense of production and efficiency. So whenever there is a problem, they'll pause everything to make sure that the problem is investigated appropriately, right? And if EDF already obviously does this, in case EDF was not compliant or less than compliant, there is plenty of regulatory bodies for the nuclear industry in France that would force EDF to take the appropriate measures. And therefore, when faults like this happen, one should not be optimistic in terms of how long it will take to solve the problem.
The other thing, sorry, Richard, just to add, is that on the time taking to deal with these issues, it's not clear what the cause is. So that's obviously a problem. Secondly, where they are doing repairs, where they are actually carrying out repairs at Civil, where the first place they found this corrosion, and that's taking months, and that reactor has been extended months and months and months, and that's because of the time needed to repair the pipes. So it's a very complicated issue and lengthy, and does require lengthy outages.
That was going to be my next question, guys, but about the duration and the expected return of these reactors that are going to be online. I mean, could there be a case, you said last year, Paolo, that EDF upped its forecast for annual output. Could there be a case of saying it might have to reduce further?
It is a possibility. Again, a lot depends on a little bit on luck, so to speak, right? So a milder March and February would help, as well as perhaps a little bit of a break for EDF on the technical side. But if everything regarding these and all types of outages goes according to what we've seen in the past, I would not be expecting outages to be shorter than already announced, possibly a little longer. It's really difficult to be able to tell, if and how much. But if one could only say, longer or shorter, I would say longer. And then whether that leads to a decrease in annual forecast, again, I think EDF will work really hard to make sure that does not happen. But we'll have to see in a couple of months, how things are proceeding before we can say whether EDF will further reduce their target down.
Absolutely, I think we'll be waiting on the results of a lot of these tests. But Paolo, if I can also ask you, what France has historically been a net exporter, but in the fourth quarter last year, it flipped to being a net importer. What do you expect to happen in the coming months?
To my memory, the only other time that France was meaningfully importing is during the sort of cold snap episode in January, February 2012, where for a few days there was a lot of really cold weather over a very wide area of Europe, and France was, once again in a position of need in the winter. But other than that, France, throughout the period, if you go back, 10, 15 years or more, has always been an exporter on the strength of its nuclear generation. Now, this is a period where this strength is coming, is under challenge, so to speak, because of the combined effect of the pandemic, as we said, the long-lived problems that EDF has been dealing with that have to do with the reduction of its workforce, i.e. in terms of engineering capability, and I'm not going to judge overly ambitious, the very ambitious program, the Grand Carénage program, which has, is been done so that the decennial visits, the fourth 10-year visits to extend the lifetime of these nuclear units are being carried on, right? Which is a very crucial point as we move, as we look forward to 2030 and beyond, right? It is extremely important that EDF gets to prolong the life of its nuclear units where possible, right? And so this is going to take additional inspections. So anyways, EDF is very much under, pressure situation, and this pressure situation is not going to be let down anytime soon. So EDF, and with it France, and with it Europe, will have to deal with this situation for a bit longer.
It couldn't have come as a worse time in the middle of the energy crisis, lack of gas as an alternative, et cetera, and there's hardly a day where you don't have an energy crisis in the headlines. But Chris, if I can ask you, but for an outsider, this would seem a bit odd that at one time, on the one side, you see, almost not on a yearly basis, but very often certain problems emerging at reactors, and not just in one series, but across series. But yet at the same time, they're prolonging the lifetimes of these reactors. This does seem a bit odd.
This is sort of continuing what Paolo is saying. These problems are long-lived. There's a lot of pressure on EDF because they're trying to extend reactors, and as reactors age, the problems get worse. That is very true, and that's the situation that France finds itself in. It has a policy of extending reactors. That's really what it does, because they don't plan to close that many, and even that plan to close 12 more reactors by 2035 looks very, very shaky now. It looks a lot of analysts, and I don't know what Paolo thinks it is, but say they probably won't meet that target. But it's a question of aging and a lot of pressure on them. These 10-year visits have all been extended as they find more and more issues. And then on top of that, you get these corrosion things. Almost every autumn or winter, we have a new problem coming up. So it's a culmination of different issues, pressure piled on with COVID, et cetera, and these latest issues. France is left in a situation where they have to extend reactors. Just to say also that there's no, at the moment, it's the French Safety Authority who will decide whether France can actually extend reactors in the way it wants to, because. They've given the generic green light for the 900s reactors to be extended, but then they have to be checked individually. Each reactor has to be checked before they get the green light. But there's no guarantee, and the ASN have said this several times, there's no guarantee whatsoever that they will be able to extend the reactors beyond 50 years. And that's very important, because that's what EDF wants to do. And that puts them in quite a crunch situation, I would argue, because they can't extend reactors. If they can't extend reactors, they're having difficulty building new ones, as we know about. They're way behind in their renewable targets. It looks like some kind of a crunch.
Yeah. I mean, that was going to be my next question to you, Paolo. I mean, you have problems with nuclear, problems with old, and also with the ones that are being built at the moment. Yet, what's the answer? Oh, yeah, let's build more nuclear. It seems to be there's a sort of stuck in the nuclear rut. I mean, is there a viable alternative for France, Paolo?
One way to say it is there's no plan B, essentially. So what do I mean by there's no plan B? So we agreed that so France needs EDF, Europe needs EDF to produce a lot of nuclear power, or power by using nuclear electricity. These plants are old. They need to be inspected. They need to be certified to continue generating. Some of these plants will have to be decommissioned. Some new plants will have to be built. Okay, as I was speaking, we've stretched all the way to 2035. So, in my opinion, once we factor the government intervention and what the importance of these units is unlikely that there will be as many retirements going forward as it was forecast. At the same time, I point out that to build plants, new nuclear plants in scale, takes money and time. If we look at the money situation for a second, and not necessarily we're speaking about EDF, but these are not just EDF's problems. Clearly, they're also the French government's problems. EDF was supposed to spend 4 billion euros to take Flamanville, the new EPR reactor, online. We're now talking about 13 billions and still not here. Start time will happen sometime in 2023. So, these latest results and the problems EDF has had count up for another, 17 to 20 billion between the money already set aside to continue the Grand Carénage, the money that EDF will have to spend to go in the market and buy additional power that it itself cannot generate. And so if to this we add another estimate of 50 billion to build 6 new generation EPRs, with a target of these coming online in 2035, 37, the pressure is piling up to find a solution, because without money and time, these new nuclear stations are not going to happen. If that doesn't happen, how are we going to get electricity in Europe? That's my question to you guys.
Absolutely. Well, that's something that we will certainly be asking the market about, Paolo. Trust us. But Chris, you live in France. There's an election coming up. How much is nuclear part of the debate? And is the France has always been very, very pro-nuclear. We've heard before that if you were anti-nuclear, you're almost anti-French. What's the status now in terms of the election campaign? Are the present problems being talked about at all?
Yes. I mean, the energy policy, French energy policy is part of the election campaign that's ongoing. We're less than 3 months away now. So it is. But candidates are wheeled out on the radio programs and on the TV to air their views, on this issue. And nuclear comes into it because obviously the energy crisis, the price crisis is a big deal. It's a big deal all over Europe. And what does that mean in France? Well, then you start talking about nuclear policy. But what you have in France is a situation where it's almost like, you have a situation, it's right versus right, it looks like. Right, I don't mean as in right and wrong. I mean as in right and left. The front runners are on the right, let's put it that way. I mean, let's call Emmanuel Macron a centrist then, centre-right if you like, but his main opponents, it seems, at the moment are on the right. And they some of their ideas are quite interesting, possibly even entertaining, like, Marine Le Pen of the far right, Front National or whatever they're called now, would actually take down wind parks that are already operating, as well as have a moratorium on wind, for example. But what I'm saying is the right in general wants to build new reactors. They don't seem to do they necessarily understand what they're talking about? That's a good question. Do they know about the details of nuclear policy? I think this is a question tied in with sovereignty, perhaps wrongly, independence, stuff like that, climate change. These kind of words and topics are bandied around, and do politicians who occasionally poke their noses into French energy policy actually understand what they're talking about? I don't know if they do, But it is right versus right in a way that is possibly very wrong. And you have got a situation where it looks like today, I mean, France, by the time you hear this, France will have announced perhaps more details on its new nuclear program, the first in over 30 years, with potentially up to 14 new EPRs being talked about. But, these are just plans. They're just being talked about. EDF has already said it's very difficult for them to do anything unless they have financial backing from the state and new regulatory measures. I mean, Levy himself said this not very long ago. The plans about 14 reactors, unless there's some kind of major state backing and regulatory changes, they won't happen. They can't do it. They can't actually do it, EDF. They don't have the clout, the financial clout to do it. But anyway, these issues are talked about in France. I don't know how deeply or how accurately, but they are on the agenda. And as things stand, France looks like it's the next president will probably sign sign off these new nuclear reactors, because obviously Macron can't do it unless he becomes president. And even though he's the front runner, he still hasn't said he's running for as a candidate.
Paolo, the sums you mentioned as well, the 17 billion, the 50 billion for new build, these are eye-watering sums. And if I was a renewables developer or in building wind or solar farms in France, I'd be weeping in despair. I mean, what's the outlook for renewables growth in France?
I think the outlook, despite everything, is good, because even though this energy crisis has exposed the fact that some of the projections about having a fully renewable Europe are a little bit of a, let's say that they're unrealistic at the moment, right? That what that means is that nuclear will still be needed, but it does not mean that we're not going to proceed with more environmentally friendly goals and therefore proceed with renewables. So nuclear needed, not going away, but renewables also see a bright future in France and and alongside Europe.
Have you made any forecasts or analysis of the place of nuclear in France's energy mix? I mean, will it stick around the 70% mark, or will it fall down to 50% as it planned to do a few years ago?
So I've not done any specific analysis of this topic, but what I can tell you is that it will be not as strong. Again, it takes time, right? Looking at how electricity is supplied, will take time for nuclear to, go off being the major producer, right? And at the same time, the growth of renewables is starting from a relatively speaking low place, especially in France. So that growth will continue unabated. I don't think we're going to go back to the days of, the sort of like glorious 30, between 1945 and 1975 in France, where after the war, there was a rebuilding, industry rebuilding, eventually nuclear industry built up and so on and so forth. We're not, those days are a bit in the past, but what we do and we'll see is a continuation of nuclear, because France cannot do without nuclear, and neither can Europe without French nuclear to a large extent.
Paolo and Chris, thank you very much for joining the Montel Weekly podcast.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So listeners, you can now follow the podcast on our own Twitter account, aptly named the Montel Weekly Podcast. Please direct message any suggestions, questions, or, let us know if you think you have a good idea for a guest on the show. You can also send us an email to podcast@montelnews.com. Lastly, remember to keep up to date with all that's happening in energy markets on Montel News. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you and goodbye.